The Alpha King ordered a blind pup buried alive until one Omega defied the entire pack. The law of the winter is absolute, the Alpha King's voice rumbled, vibrating through the frost-heavy air like a coming avalanche. He did not look at the whimpering bundle of fur on the ice. It is blind. It cannot hunt. It cannot fight. Bury it. The enforcer's spade struck the frozen earth. No! The scream tore through the silent pack. Before the shovel could fall again, a frail figure threw herself into the open grave, curling her body over the shivering pup. Camila, the lowest Omega, looked up into the lethal amber eyes of the Alpha King. "If you bury him," she breathed, her voice shaking but her chin raised, "you will have to bury me too." The northern wastes did not forgive weakness. For centuries, the Blood Moon Pack had survived the brutal, endless winters by shedding anything that could not carry its own weight. The frost was a living thing here, creeping over the pines, turning the needles into jagged glass, and stealing the breath from the lungs of the young and the old. Camila stood at the very edge of the gathering, her thin, threadbare cloak pulled tight across her shoulders. As an Omega, her place was in the shadows, unseen and unheard, surviving on the scraps of the pack's brutal hierarchy. The snow crunched beneath the heavy boots of the warriors, forming a circle in the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of pine, ozone, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. In the center of the ring stood King Gregory. He was a mountain of a man, draped in the dark, heavy furs of a dire wolf. Shadows seemed to cling to his broad shoulders, weaving through the dark strands of his hair. When he breathed, the mist plumed around his face like smoke from a dragon's maw. He was ancient law made flesh, ruthless, unyielding, and terrifyingly beautiful. His eyes, a piercing, molten amber, swept over the gathered wolves. Where his gaze fell, heads bowed, spines curved. Submission was not a choice. It was an instinct dragged from the marrow of their bones. At Gregory's feet lay the cause of the gathering. It was barely larger than a man's boot, a newborn pup, entirely black save for a patch of white over its chest that looked like a crescent moon. It was shivering violently, its tiny, helpless cries barely audible over the howling wind. But it was not the cold that had condemned it. When the pup lifted its head, searching blindly for a mother who had already perished in the snow, its eyes were covered in a thick, milky film. Blind, a death sentence in the Blood Moon Pack. "The winter takes what it must," Gregory's voice echoed, devoid of malice but equally devoid of mercy. It was the voice of the mountain itself. "We do not waste blood or warmth on that which the goddess has already claimed." He gave a sharp nod to his lead enforcer. The hulking wolf stepped forward, a heavy iron spade in his grip. The ground had already been broken, a shallow, dark hollow carved into the permafrost. The enforcer reached down, grabbing the pup by the scruff of its neck. The tiny creature shrieked a high, reedy sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Something inside Camila snapped. It was not a conscious decision. It was a violent, primal rejection of the world as it was. The ancient laws, the hierarchy, the sheer terror of the Alpha King, all of it dissolved into the falling snow. All she could hear was the heartbeat of the tiny creature, fluttering wildly, begging for a warmth it had never known. She broke rank. Gasps rippled through the gathered wolves as the small, fragile Omega darted across the sacred circle. Her boots slipped on the ice, but she threw her weight forward, colliding with the enforcer's knees just as he swung the pup over the dark pit. The massive man stumbled, dropping the bundle. Camila scrambled over the jagged ice, her bare hands scraping against the frozen dirt, and scooped the pup into her chest. She curled into a tight ball at the edge of the grave, wrapping her thin cloak around the shivering mass of fur, pressing her own racing heartbeat against its freezing body. Silence descended on the clearing. It was not the quiet of the wind, but the breathless, suffocating silence of a world waiting to end. The enforcer recovered, snarling, his hand raising to strike the Omega, who had dared to touch a condemned soul. But a low, vibrating growl stopped him in his tracks. Camila did not look up. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the killing blow. She could feel the pup's tiny nose pressing into her collarbone, seeking her scent, seeking life. She breathed in the smell of wet fur and milk. "I am sorry," she thought to the pup. "I am so sorry." The slow, heavy crunch of boots approached her. 1 step. 2. The temperature around her seemed to drop, the air growing so dense it was hard to draw into her lungs. The scent of dark pine, wood smoke, and absolute dominance washed over her. King Gregory stopped inches from her kneeling form. The tips of his dark boots touched the hem of her frayed skirt. "Look at me." The command was soft. It did not carry the booming roar of an alpha demanding submission. It slipped beneath her skin, vibrating against her ribs. Slowly, trembling like a leaf in a gale, Camilla lifted her head. She met the molten amber of the king's eyes. Up close, the sheer force of his presence was intoxicating, a heavy weight that made her want to press her forehead to the ice and never rise. But her arms tightened around the pup. Gregory stared down at her. He saw the bruises on her cheekbones, the hollows of her throat, the pathetic thinness of her cloak. Yet, in her wide, frightened eyes, he saw something that had not existed in his pack for 100 years. Defiance. Pure, irrational, burning defiance. He tilted his head, the wind catching the dark strands of his hair. "You know the penalty for interfering with the king's justice, Omega." "I do," Camilla whispered, her breath ghosting white between them. "And yet," Gregory murmured, his eyes dropping to the tiny black nose poking out from her arms. "You shield a corpse." "He is breathing, my king," she said, her voice cracking. "He is breathing." Gregory held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The wind howled around them, whipping the snow into a frenzy. But within the space between the Alpha and the Omega, the world stood perfectly still. "Bring her to my hall," Gregory commanded, turning his broad back to her. The dark furs of his cape swept over the snow. "If she wishes to champion the dead, she will answer for it in the dark." The great ironwood doors of the king's hall slammed shut with a finality that rattled Camilla's teeth. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muted, replaced by the crackle and hiss of the massive stone hearth that dominated the far wall. Camilla stood dripping onto the dark furs that lined the floor. She was trembling so violently she could barely remain upright. In her arms, the pup had stopped crying, its tiny body completely exhausted, taking shallow, ragged breaths against her collarbone. The hall was vast, steeped in shadows and the heavy, intoxicating scent of the Alpha King. There were no guards, no enforcers, just the fire, the shadows, and him. Gregory stood by the hearth, stripping his heavy leather gloves from his hands. He tossed them onto a heavy wooden table and turned to face her. In the firelight, the hard, unforgiving lines of his jaw and the broad expanse of his chest seemed to command the very air in the room. He did not look like a man. He looked like a predator merely wearing the shape of one. "Come closer," he said. Camilla's feet felt like lead, but the Alpha's command pulled at the invisible tethers of her blood. She stepped closer to the fire, the sudden heat biting into her numb skin like needles. She kept her arms securely around the pup, shielding it from his view. Gregory watched her every movement. He was a creature of war and logic. His entire life had been dictated by the brutal arithmetic of survival. The weak died so the strong could endure. It was a law written in blood and ice. And yet, this creature, this broken, starving Omega had thrown herself into an open grave. "Put it on the table." Camilla's breath hitched. "Please, my king," I said. "Put it on the table, Camilla." The sound of her name on his lips sent a strange, terrifying jolt through her spine. She stepped up to the massive oak table and gently, so gently, lowered the bundle of her cloak onto the wood. She unwrapped the edges, exposing the tiny, shivering pup to the firelight. Gregory stepped up beside her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The heavy scent of pine and wild earth enveloped her, making her lightheaded. He reached out with one massive, scarred hand. Camilla instinctively flinched, biting her lip to keep from crying out, expecting him to crush the creature's skull. Instead, Gregory's long fingers brushed over the pup's damp fur. The touch was startlingly gentle. The pup, blind and freezing, let out a weak whine and instinctively nuzzled against the warmth of the king's knuckles, its tiny pink tongue darting out to taste the salt on his skin. Gregory's hand stilled. He stared at the blind, milky eyes looking blindly up at him, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "The winter is a crucible," Gregory said quietly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Camilla's chest. "It burns away the fragile. To show mercy to something that cannot survive is a cruelty in itself. You only prolong its suffering. He is not suffering because he is blind," Camilla whispered, daring to look up at the towering alpha. "He is suffering because he is cold. Because he was thrown away." Gregory slowly turned his head to look at her. The amber fires in his eyes seemed to flare, burning away the shadows in the room. "The law is the law. If I spare this one, where does it end? Do I feed the lame while my warriors starve? Do I shelter the dying while the healthy freeze?" "He is not dying," she pleaded, her voice thick with unshed tears. She reached out, her small, pale fingers brushing against Gregory's massive hand as she touched the pup's back. The brief contact of their skin sent a sharp, electric shock up her arm, but she didn't pull away. "He is fighting. Just give him a chance to fight." Gregory stared down at where their hands met over the tiny black wolf. He felt the tremor in her fingers, the desperate, fierce heat of her spirit. She was an Omega, meant to be docile, meant to yield, yet she stood in his hall, defying him, challenging the very foundation of his rule. He slowly pulled his hand away, the absence of his heat leaving Camilla's skin strangely cold. "You believe he can survive," Gregory said, stepping back into the shadows. "I know he can," Camilla answered, though her heart pounded with terror. "Then the burden of his life is yours," Gregory decreed, his voice hardening back into the unforgiving tone of the king. "You will take him to the stone chamber in the lower keep. There is no fire there, no furs, only the stone." Camilla's eyes widened. The lower keep was a freezing tomb. "If he is alive when the sun rises," Gregory continued, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity, "he may remain in the pack. And so may you." The unsaid words hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. "And if he dies, you die with him." Camilla looked down at the shivering pup. She gathered him back into her arms, pressing him against her collarbone. She looked back at the Alpha King, her chin lifting in a silent, resolute promise. "We will see the sun, my king." The stone chamber was darker than a closed eye and colder than a grave. Deep in the bowels of the mountain keep, the wind did not howl. It whispered through the cracks in the masonry like ghosts trailing icy fingers over Camilla's skin. She sat huddled in the corner, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She had unlaced the front of her thin dress, pressing the tiny, shivering pup directly against her bare skin, right over her heart. She wrapped her threadbare cloak tightly around them both, creating a small, desperate pocket of warmth. Hours bled into one another. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, sinking its teeth into her joints. She could feel her own core temperature dropping, her fingers growing stiff and clumsy. But every time her eyes drifted shut, heavy with the seductive pull of the freezing dark, the tiny creature against her chest would shift, its weak heartbeat tapping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I have you," she whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. She rubbed her numb hands up and down her own arms, trying to generate friction. "I have you. Little moon, keep beating. Just keep beating." Above, in the great hall, the fire roared. Gregory sat in his high-backed wooden chair, staring into the flames. A heavy goblet of spiced wine sat untouched in his hand. The great keep was silent, the pack long asleep, but the Alpha King could not close his eyes. His senses were too sharp. Even through feet of solid stone, he could feel the chilling void of the lower chamber. He could smell the sharp, metallic tang of the frost, and, if he focused, he could hear the faint, fluttering heartbeat of the Omega and the pup. "She is dying," his wolf snarled in his mind, pacing relentlessly behind his ribs. "You sent her into the dark to die." Gregory tightened his grip on the silver goblet until the metal groaned and buckled. He told himself it was the law. It was the way of the blood moon. If the cold took her, it meant the goddess willed it. He was a king. He could not be swayed by large, frightened eyes or the soft, desperate plea of a broken girl, but he could still feel the brush of her fingers against his. He could still see the impossible fire in her eyes when she had thrown herself into the dirt. With a curse that echoed off the high rafters, Gregory threw the crushed goblet into the hearth. The wine hissed and flared. He stood up, his massive frame casting a terrifying, leaping shadow across the hall, and marched toward the heavy iron door leading to the lower keep. Down in the dark, Camilla had stopped shivering. She knew what that meant. The dangerous, euphoric warmth was beginning to spread through her limbs. The pain of the cold was fading, replaced by a heavy, beautiful lethargy. The pup against her chest had grown still, its breathing so shallow she could barely feel it. Just a little longer, she breathed, though she couldn't hear her own voice. The heavy iron lock of the chamber door scraped with a deafening screech. The hinges groaned, and suddenly, a blinding swath of golden light spilled into the freezing room. Camilla couldn't open her eyes, but she felt the sudden, massive shift in the air. The heavy, intoxicating scent of pine and ozone flooded the small space, driving back the smell of the frost. Gregory stood in the doorway, a burning torch in one hand, an enormous, thick pelt of bear fur draped over his arm. When the torchlight fell on Camilla, his breath caught in his throat. She was curled into a tiny, fragile ball in the corner, her skin pale as marble, her lips tinged blue. She looked like a statue carved from ice. Dropping the torch into a wall sconce, Gregory crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He fell to his knees beside her, the hard stone cracking under the impact. He reached out, his large, burning hot hands cupping her freezing face. "Camilla." His voice was a harsh, desperate rasp. Her eyelashes fluttered, dusted with actual frost. She leaned weakly into the immense heat of his palm, a soft sigh escaping her blue lips. "My king," she murmured, her voice a ghost. He is still breathing." Gregory looked down. Tucked securely against her chest, shielded from the stone by her own body, the little black pup slept soundly, its chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence. She had drained her own life to keep the fire burning in the condemned creature. A heavy, unfamiliar ache bloomed in the center of the Alpha King's chest. It was not pity. It was awe. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he unrolled the massive, heavy bear pelt. Without a word, he wrapped it entirely around her, lifting her and the pup together as if they weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. He pressed her tightly against his own chest, surrounding her with his overwhelming, furnace-like body heat. Camilla gasped as the warmth hit her, burying her face into the crook of his neck. She smelled like ice and sheer willpower. Gregory held her there in the dark, his jaw resting gently against the crown of her head. He listened as her heartbeat slowly, steadily began to match the heavy, thumping rhythm of his own. The ancient laws of his ancestors screamed in the back of his mind. Weakness must be purged. But as the Alpha King carried the Omega and the blind pup out of the dark and up toward the warmth of his fire, he knew the law was broken. And for the first time in his long, brutal reign, he did not care. "You survived the night, little bird," Gregory whispered into her hair, his amber eyes glowing in the torchlight. "Now, the real fight begins." Warmth was a foreign language Camilla's body did not know how to speak. For her entire life, waking meant the sharp ache of stiff joints, the biting draft of the Omega barracks, and the dull, throbbing hollow of a half-empty stomach. But as consciousness slowly returned to her, it did not bring the familiar sting of the frost. Instead, she was cocooned in a suffocating, heavy heat. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above was high, vaulted stone, scarred by centuries of soot. She was sinking into a massive bed, buried beneath layers of thick, silver-tipped wolf pelts and heavy woolen blankets. The air in the room was thick, smelling of burning cedar, old leather, and the overpowering, intoxicating scent of pine and wild earth. The king, panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the drowsy warmth. Camilla bolted upright, her fingers frantically clawing at the furs. "The pup, beside you." The voice rumbled from the shadows, low and rough as unpolished timber. Camilla froze, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly turned her head. Nestled in a deep hollow of the pillows, entirely engulfed by the massive furs, The tiny black pup was curled into a perfect circle. His chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The milky film over his unseeing eyes was hidden behind peacefully closed lids. He was alive. A ragged sob of relief tore from Camilla's throat. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently stroking the white crescent moon patch on his tiny chest. He let out a soft, contented sigh, leaning blindly into her touch. Only then did she dare to look across the room. Gregory sat in a massive, high-backed chair near the hearth. He had not slept. He still wore the dark leather and heavy furs from the night before, though his cape had been discarded over the back of the chair. The firelight painted half of his face in shifting gold, leaving the rest swallowed by the dark. His amber eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, tracking the flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. "You brought us to your chambers," Camilla whispered, the realization making her blood run cold even beneath the heavy pelts. The Alpha King's sanctum was forbidden. To cross its threshold without invitation was death. To sleep in his bed was unheard of. "The lower keep would have claimed you both before dawn," Gregory stated flatly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive hands clasping loosely in front of him. "I gave you a condition for survival, Omega. You met it." "Camilla," she said softly. Gregory's brow furrowed, a dangerous, barely perceptible shift in his expression. "What?" "My name," she said, pulling the furs up to her chin, feeling impossibly small under the weight of his stare. "It is Camilla, not Omega." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The audacity of her words hung in the air, a blatant challenge to the absolute hierarchy that governed their kind. Omegas did not correct alphas. They certainly did not correct kings. Gregory did not snarl. He did not rise to strike her. Instead, a muscle feathered along his sharp jawline. He tasted the name on his tongue, locking it away behind his ribs. "Camilla," he murmured, the way he said it slow, deliberate, like a predator turning a delicate bone over in its jaws sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "You have bought the blind creature a single day, but you have cost us something far more dangerous." He stood up, his sheer size instantly dominating the vast room. The fire seemed to dim in his presence. He walked slowly toward the bed, his footfalls completely silent on the stone floor. Camilla instinctively pressed herself back against the headboard, pulling the pup closer to her chest. Gregory stopped at the edge of the mattress. He reached out. Camilla flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, but the blow never came. Instead, the backs of his knuckles grazed the side of her neck, just below her ear. His skin was burning hot, calloused and rough. The touch was agonizingly slow, wiping away a smudge of dirt from her pale skin. The sheer contrast between his lethal strength and the terrifying gentleness of his touch made Camilla's breath hitch. "The pack smelled you on me when I carried you up from the dark," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. His thumb brushed over her racing pulse. "They know I broke the law of the winter to save a broken thing. They know I showed mercy." Camilla opened her eyes, looking up into the molten amber of his gaze. She saw the heavy burden of the crown there, the absolute isolation of a ruler who could never afford to be soft. "Mercy is not a weakness." "My king," she breathed, her chest rising and falling erratically against his hand. Gregory's eyes darkened, dropping for a split second to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. In the Blood Moon Pack, mercy is an invitation to a slaughter. A heavy, resounding knock echoed through the chamber doors, followed by the muffled, agitated voices of the pack elders. The sound shattered the fragile, quiet intimacy of the room. Gregory pulled his hand away, the cold air instantly rushing in to claim the spot his skin had warmed. His jaw set into stone. The king returned to his eyes. "Stay here," he commanded, turning his back to her. "Do not make a sound." The great hall was an echo chamber of ancient stone and simmering violence. From the shadowed balcony above the main floor, Camilla crouched behind the heavy iron balustrade. She clutched the sleeping pup inside her cloak, pressing her hand over his small snout to muffle his breathing. Below her, the morning light filtered weakly through the high, frosted windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. The inner circle of the Blood Moon Pack had gathered. 5 elders, their faces scarred by decades of brutal winters, stood in a half-circle before the king's empty throne. Behind them, a dozen elite enforcers shifted uneasily, the scent of their agitation sour and metallic rising up to the balcony. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Gregory entered. He wore no crown, but he needed none. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his aura rolled through the hall like a physical wave. The low murmurs of the elders instantly ceased. Spines snapped straight. Throats were bared in reflex. He walked with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator, his dark furs sweeping over the flagstones. He bypassed the carved wooden throne, choosing instead to stand on the dais, forcing the elders to look up at him. "Speak," Gregory commanded. The single word cracked like a whip in the silent hall. Elder Silas, a gray-muzzled wolf with a milky, blinded eye of his own, stepped forward. He leaned heavily on a twisted staff of ironwood, but his surviving eye burned with righteous fury. "My king," Silas began, his voice raspy but carrying easily through the cavernous space. "The pack is unsettled." Whispers spread through the barracks. "They say the Omega who broke the sacred circle still lives. They say the cursed, sightless pup still draws breath. They say true," Gregory answered, his face an unreadable mask of granite. A collective gasp rippled through the enforcers. Silas slammed the base of his staff against the stone. "Madness!" the elder barked, forgetting his place for a fraction of a second. "The law of the winter has kept this pack alive for 500 years. We shed the weak so the strong may hunt. If the king himself defies the law, the foundation of the blood moon rots from within. Are you accusing me of rot, Silas?" Gregory's voice did not raise in volume, but the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew so dense it was hard to breathe. A low, vibrating growl began to emanate from the Alpha's chest, rattling the iron fixtures on the walls. Silas swallowed hard, taking a half step back, submitting to the overwhelming pressure. But the old wolf was stubborn. "I am accusing you of sentiment, my king, a luxury we cannot afford. The winter is harsh this year. The elk herds are thin. We cannot waste meat on an Omega who defies the pack, nor a creature that cannot see the prey it hunts." "She survived the night in the lower keep," Gregory countered, his eyes sweeping over the gathered wolves, challenging anyone to dispute him. "The ice did not claim her. The goddess spared her. I merely honored the outcome." Up on the balcony, Camilla's heart slammed against her ribs. He was defending her. The terrifying, ruthless Alpha King was twisting the ancient religion of their ancestors to protect the lowest member of his pack. "She survived because you gave her your heat," another elder spat from the back, though he cowered immediately when Gregory's lethal gaze snapped to him. "If the Omega is so favored by the goddess," Silas interjected smoothly, sensing the rising bloodlust in the room, "then let the goddess judge her true worth. Not the king." Gregory went utterly still. "Watch your tongue, old man. I invoke the right of the blood hunt," Silas declared, his voice echoing off the high rafters. The hall erupted into a cacophony of snarls and protests. Camilla clamped a hand over her own mouth to stifle a gasp. The blood hunt. It was a brutal, archaic tradition. A wolf accused of weakness was sent into the haunted pine forests beyond the pack borders at sundown. They had to survive the night alone, without weapons, hunted by the pack's elite trackers. It was an execution masquerading as a trial. "She is an Omega," Gregory roared, the sound deafening, rattling the stained glass in the windows. "She has no combat training. It is a slaughter. If she has the strength to defy the Alpha King, she has the strength to survive the woods," Silas countered, his surviving eye gleaming with malicious triumph. "If she survives until dawn, she and the sightless pup may remain. Her defiance will be proven as strength. If she falls, the winter takes what it must." The elders murmured in agreement. The enforcers nodded. To deny the right once invoked was to deny the fundamental religion of the shifter packs. It would trigger a mutiny. Gregory stood rigid on the dais, his massive hands curled into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves groaning under the strain. He looked up, his amber eyes piercing straight through the shadows of the balcony, locking directly onto Camilla. He knew she was there. He had known the whole time. Across the vast, freezing distance of the great hall, their eyes met. Camila saw the trapped fury in his gaze, the terrifying realization that his absolute power had a limit. She slowly stood up from behind the balustrade, stepping into the weak shafts of morning light. She did not lower her head. She did not break his gaze. She offered him a single, barely perceptible nod. Gregory's jaw locked. He looked back down at the elders, the amber in his eyes bleeding into a violent, feral crimson. "The right is accepted," the Alpha King decreed, his voice devoid of all emotion. At sundown, the Omega runs. The armory was a sanctuary of cold iron and honed steel, hidden deep within the eastern wing of the keep. The air here smelled heavily of oil, sharpening stones, and old blood. Camila stood awkwardly in the center of the room, shivering despite the thick woolen tunic Gregory had ordered the servants to bring her. Through the narrow slit windows, the moon was already rising, casting long silver blades of light across the racks of weaponry. Sundown was less than 2 hours away. The heavy door groaned open, and Gregory stepped inside. He had shed his heavy cape, wearing only a dark, fitted leather tunic that highlighted the massive, corded muscles of his chest and arms. He carried a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He didn't speak as he crossed the room. The silence between them was heavy, charged with an undeniable, terrifying gravity. He stopped in front of her, the sheer size of his body blocking out the moonlight. "The pup is safe?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Sleeping in your chambers," Camila replied softly. "Thank you for guarding him." Gregory unrolled the oiled cloth on a nearby anvil. Inside lay a hunting knife. It was not a grand, ceremonial weapon. It was brutally practical, 8 inches of dark, matte steel, perfectly balanced, with a handle wrapped in worn leather. "The right dictates you enter the woods without pack weapons," Gregory said, picking up the blade. He turned to her. "This is not a pack weapon. It was my father's. It is a personal gift. If they find it on you, they will kill you for carrying it. But if you do not carry it, the woods will kill you first." He held it out, handle first. Camila reached out, her small, pale fingers wrapping around the leather grip. The knife was surprisingly heavy. Her hand trembled under its weight. Suddenly, Gregory stepped closer. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the dark pine and spice of his scent. He reached out, his massive hands covering hers. His skin was rough, calloused from years of war, but his touch was incredibly precise. "Your grip is too tight," he murmured, his breath stirring the loose hairs at her temple. "You are holding it like a shield." "It is not a shield. It is a fang." He stepped behind her. Camila's breath hitched as his broad, solid chest pressed flush against her back. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to her core. Her knees threatened to buckle, but he held her steady, his large hands guiding her arms. "Relax your shoulders," he commanded softly, his voice vibrating directly into her spine. She tried to exhale, forcing her tense muscles to loosen. Gregory's hand slid down her arm, his long fingers wrapping over her knuckles, adjusting her grip on the blade until it sat perfectly balanced in her palm. "The trackers will be fast," Gregory said, his lips mere inches from her ear. "They rely on sight and scent. The snow will hide your scent if you stay low, rubbing the pine needles into your clothes. You do not run. Running triggers their prey drive. You hide. And if they find you..." He suddenly gripped her wrist, violently twisting her arm backward in a simulated strike. Camila gasped, her back arching into his chest. "You do not aim for the heart," he finished, his grip on her wrist bruising, though she didn't try to pull away. "The rib cage will catch the blade. You aim for the throat, the soft tissue right beneath the jaw." He held her there in the moonlight, her arm raised, the blade glinting silver in the dark. The violence of the lesson was completely eclipsed by the overwhelming intimacy of their bodies pressed together. In the quiet of the armory, the only sound was the synchronized, heavy thudding of their hearts. Gregory slowly lowered her arm. He didn't step back. Instead, he turned her gently by the shoulders to face him. The Alpha King looked down at the lowest Omega. His amber eyes were stripped of their usual cold authority. In the shadows, they looked desperate, haunted. "I cannot fight them for you, Camila," he whispered, the admission sounding like it was tearing him apart from the inside. If I intervene, it means civil war. The pack will tear itself apart, and you will be the first casualty. I know, she said, looking up at him, her heart aching at the profound agony etched into his harsh features. She reached up, her small hand pressing flat against his broad, leather-clad chest, right over his heart. You gave us a chance. That is more than anyone has ever done. Gregory stared at her hand against his chest. Slowly, reverently, he lifted his own hand, his rough fingers brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His thumb lingered on the soft skin of her cheek. The touch was so tender it made Camilla's eyes burn with unshed tears. He leaned down, his face hovering just inches from hers. The scent of him enveloped her completely, making her dizzy. She instinctively closed her eyes, her lips parting as she waited for the brush of his mouth. A deep, mournful note echoed through the stone walls. The horn of the hunt. Gregory froze. The tender spell shattered, replaced instantly by the brutal reality of the night. He pulled back, his jaw clenching so hard it looked carved from stone. The king returned, but the alpha who looked at her now was a beast denied. Run fast, little bird, Gregory said, his voice raw with suppressed emotion, and come back to me. The haunted pine forest was a graveyard of ancient, towering trees, their thick branches woven so tightly they choked out the stars. Camilla ran until her lungs burned with the taste of copper and frost. The snow here was deeper, untouched by the pack's daily paths, dragging at her knees like heavy, frozen hands. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, morphing into the shape of a leaping wolf. She remembered Gregory's voice, a heavy rumble in the dark. You do not run. You hide. She threw herself toward the massive, upturned root system of a fallen ironwood tree. The earth had been ripped from the ground centuries ago, creating a shallow, jagged cave beneath the frost. Camilla crawled into the hollow, the frozen dirt scraping against her palms. She stripped her gloves off with her teeth and dug her bare hands into the needles and thick, hardened sap of the surrounding pines. She smeared the pungent, sticky resin over her neck, her wrists, and the hem of her cloak, desperately trying to mask the terrified scent of her own adrenaline. The cold was absolute, seeping through her boots, but she clamped her teeth down on her own lip to stop the violent chattering of her jaw. She pulled Gregory's dark steel knife from her belt. The leather grip was still warm from his touch. Awoh! The howl tore through the canopy, startling a flock of ravens from the upper branches. It was close. Too close. Camilla pressed her back against the frozen dirt, merging with the shadows. She slowed her breathing until she was taking tiny, agonizing sips of the icy air. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of paws hitting the snow echoed through the trees. Through the tangled roots, Camilla saw him. It was a massive, slate-gray wolf, one of Silas's elite trackers. The beast's nose was to the ground, its amber eyes glowing with a predatory, sickly light. Steam plumed from its jagged jaws. The tracker paused directly in front of the fallen tree. Camilla's heart stopped. She could smell the wet fur, the old blood of previous hunts. The wolf lifted its massive head, inhaling deeply, parsing the frigid air. The sap was failing. The beast's ears snapped forward, locking onto the faint, rhythmic flutter of her heartbeat. With a terrifying snarl, the wolf lunged. The roots splintered as the massive beast crashed into her hollow. Claws like iron raked across Camilla's shoulder, tearing through her cloak and biting deep into her flesh. She screamed, the pain blinding and white-hot, but instinct and the memory of the king's hands guiding hers took over. She did not cower. She did not raise the blade like a shield. As the beast opened its jaws to crush her windpipe, Camilla threw her weight forward. Slipping beneath the snapping teeth, she drove the hunting knife upward, burying the dark steel deep into the soft, unarmored flesh right beneath the beast's jaw. The tracker let out a garbled, choking shriek. Its momentum carried them both backward, the massive weight of the wolf pinning Camilla to the frozen earth. Hot, metallic blood spilled over her hands. The beast thrashed, its claws tearing uselessly at the snow, before its eyes rolled back and its heavy body went entirely limp. Camilla lay trapped beneath the stifling weight, gasping for air, her blood mingling with the beast's. The wound on her shoulder pulsed with a sick, burning agony. her vision blurred at the edges, the cold rapidly sinking its teeth into her shock-weakened body. "Come back to me." Gregory's final command echoed in her mind, a tether pulling her back from the seductive dark. With a raw, tearing sob, Camilla shoved the heavy carcass off her chest. She dragged herself out of the hollow, leaving a trail of crimson on the pristine white snow. She leaned heavily against a pine trunk, clutching her bleeding shoulder. Through the break in the trees, a faint, bruised purple light began to bleed into the horizon. Dawn. She had survived the night, but as she staggered toward the edge of the tree line, a dark, imposing silhouette stepped out from the morning mist, blocking her path to the rising sun. Elder Silas stood at the boundary of the woods, his ironwood staff planted firmly in the snow. Flanking him were 3 enforcers, their faces twisted into masks of cold, absolute disdain. Camilla stumbled, her knees hitting the permafrost. She was a ruin of torn cloth, smeared dirt, and blood. Her breath hitched in her chest, every inhalation feeling like shards of glass. She looked up at the rising sun, its weak, golden rays barely reaching her face, and then looked at Silas. "The sun," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw the sun." Silas's surviving eye narrowed, devoid of any honor or mercy. He looked at the blood soaking her tunic, then at the empty woods behind her. "You reek of a tracker's blood. Omega, you used a weapon. A violation of the right. I used what I needed to survive." Camilla breathed, gripping her injured shoulder. "I met your conditions. You cheated the goddess," Silas spat, stepping forward, his knuckles white around his staff. "And the penalty for desecrating the ancient ways is immediate execution." He raised the heavy ironwood staff high above his head, aiming for her skull. Camilla didn't close her eyes. She stared down the cruel elder, her chin lifting in the exact same defiant angle she had shown the Alpha King. She had fought. She had won. She would not die a coward. The staff swung down. It never connected. A blur of dark fur and terrifying velocity collided with Silas. The elder was thrown through the air like a rag doll, crashing violently into the trunk of a pine tree. The thick trunk cracked under the impact. The earth itself seemed to shudder as King Gregory landed gracefully in front of Camilla. He had not shifted into his wolf form, but he was barely human. His amber eyes burned with a literal, golden fire. His fangs were extended, his chest heaving with a wrath so pure and absolute it made the surrounding air ripple with heat. "My king!" one of the enforcers stammered, taking a terrified step back. "She violated the right. She—" "Silence!" Gregory roared. The sheer concussive force of his alpha aura slammed into the enforcers, forcing them directly to their knees. The snow around Gregory's boots began to melt from the sheer heat radiating from his body. Silas groaned, spitting blood onto the snow as he tried to push himself up. You break the law for a weakling. You doom us all." Gregory walked slowly toward the elder. He reached down, grasping the thick ironwood staff Silas had dropped. With a casual, terrifying flex of his massive hands, Gregory snapped the ancient, unbreakable wood in half and tossed the pieces into the snow. "The law is dead." Gregory's voice vibrated with a dark, lethal finality. "The winter does not rule this pack anymore, Silas. I do." He turned back, his burning gaze sweeping over the kneeling enforcers. "If any wolf in this pack wishes to challenge my decree, let them stand now. Let them bleed on my claws. Otherwise, the old ways end today." No one moved. No one dared to even breathe. Gregory turned away from them, the terrifying predator instantly vanishing as his eyes fell on Camilla. He dropped to his knees in the blood-stained snow, his massive hands reaching for her. "Camilla!" he breathed, his voice breaking. He pulled her against his broad chest, oblivious to the blood soaking into his leather tunic. "I came back," she whispered, her hands weakly gripping the lapels of his armor. The adrenaline was fading, leaving nothing but a vast, freezing void in her veins. The pain in her shoulder became a distant, muffled echo. "You did, little bird," Gregory said, his large hand cupping the back of her head, pressing her face into the warm crook of his neck. He was shaking. The Alpha King, the most feared predator in the north, was trembling. "You fought so beautifully. I have you now." Camila smiled, the scent of pine and wild earth finally, blissfully overtaking the smell of the frost. The pup, he is safe, Gregory promised, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Good, Camila murmured, her eyelids fluttering shut as the darkness finally pulled her under. We saw the sun. Firelight danced across the vaulted ceiling in lazy golden waves. Camila drifted back to consciousness on a tide of impossible warmth. The biting ache in her joints was gone. Her shoulder felt tight, bound in thick, clean linen, but the searing pain had been reduced to a dull throb. She turned her head against the silk pillows. Gregory was sitting on the edge of the massive bed. He had finally stripped away the heavy leathers of his station, wearing only a loose linen shirt unlaced at the throat. The firelight caught the harsh, beautiful angles of his face, illuminating the dark circles beneath his eyes. In the center of his massive, calloused palms sat the black pup. The tiny creature was chewing happily on the king's thumb, letting out soft, playful growls. Camila let out a soft breath. Gregory's head snapped toward her, his amber eyes instantly locking onto hers. He carefully placed the pup down on the furs where it immediately began attempting to clumsily climb over the pillows and shifted closer to her. You've been asleep for 2 days, Gregory said, his voice a low, rough murmur that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. The healer said the frost almost took your heart. It couldn't, Camila said softly. She reached out from beneath the blankets. Her pale fingers found his, tangling with his large, warm hand. My heart was already claimed. Gregory inhaled sharply. He leaned over her, bracing his weight on his forearm. The heat of him enveloped her, a protective, possessive barrier against the rest of the world. He looked down at her, his eyes stripping away every title, every law, every expectation. When I heard the horn sound, Gregory whispered, his thumb slowly brushing over her cheekbone. I felt my soul tear in half. I have commanded armies. I have slaughtered kings, but watching you walk into that forest was the first time in my life I have ever known true terror. Camila's breath hitched. You gave me the strength to survive. No, Gregory said, shaking his head gently. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. You gave me the strength to finally live. You broke the ice in this pack, Camila. You broke the ice in me. He opened his eyes, the molten amber burning with a fierce, absolute devotion. You are not an Omega. You were never meant to bow. The goddess did not send you into the dark to die. She sent you to remind the blood moon what it means to protect. He shifted his weight, his large hand cupping her jaw, tilting her face up. Be my Luna, the Alpha King breathed against her lips. It was not a command. It was a plea from a man laying his entire soul bare. Rule the winter with me. Yes, Camila whispered, tears spilling over her lashes. Yes, my king. Gregory didn't hesitate. He captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, salvation, and absolute, devastating surrender. It was a gentle, consuming fire, washing away the years of starvation and fear, replacing them with a bond that resonated in the deepest, most ancient part of their blood. A tiny, wet nose bumped against Camila's cheek. They parted, breathless, resting their foreheads together. The black pup had managed to scale the pillows and was happily wagging his tail, nudging against them. Camila laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that echoed perfectly off the stone walls. She scooped the pup into her arms. When he looked up at her, the milky film still covered his eyes, but his ears were perked, fully attuned to the sound of her voice and the scent of the king. He didn't need to see. He knew exactly where he belonged. The first true sign of spring did not come with the sun, but with the sound of cracking ice. For the first time in centuries, the Blood Moon Pack did not fear the changing of the season. The heavy, oppressive dread that normally hung over the territory had vanished, replaced by a cautious, budding hope. Camila stood on the high balcony of the great hall, a thick, luxurious cloak of silver-tipped fox fur draped over her shoulders. She breathed in the sharp, crisp air. The scent of pine was still there, but beneath it lay the rich, earthy promise of damp soil and blooming frost lilies. Beside her, sitting tall and incredibly still, was the black wolf. He was no longer a tiny, shivering pup. Though only an adolescent, he was already the size of a full-grown enforcer, his muscles thick and corded beneath his sleek, midnight coat. The white crescent moon on his chest gleamed in the morning light. His milky eyes stared blankly out over the courtyard, but his ears swiveled constantly, mapping the world with absolute precision. He knew exactly where the guards stood, he knew where the ravens nested, and he knew exactly when the Alpha King stepped onto the balcony. The black wolf let out a low, rumbling chuff of greeting, his tail sweeping across the stone, before he politely padded to the edge of the balcony to give the king and his Luna privacy. Gregory wrapped his massive arms around Camila from behind, pulling her flush against his broad chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You are out of bed early, my queen. I wanted to hear the ice break," Camila murmured, leaning back into his solid warmth. She rested her hands over his where they were clasped at her waist. "It sounds like breathing," Gregory hummed in agreement, his lips pressing a soft kiss to her pulse point. "The hunting parties have returned. The elk herds are migrating back to the valley early this year. The pack will feast tonight." Camila turned in his arms, looking up into his molten amber eyes. The harsh, haunted lines that had once defined his face were gone, smoothed away by the profound, unconditional bond they shared. "And Silas? Banished to the outer rim," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a gravelly purr as he traced her jawline with his thumb. "He will live out his days as a lone wolf." The old ways went with him. Yesterday, the healers reported 3 new pups born to the lower ranks. All of them will be fed from the king's own stores. Tears pricked Camila's eyes, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, fierce joy. She reached up, weaving her fingers into the dark, heavy strands of his hair. "You saved them." "We saved them," Gregory corrected, his gaze burning with that same absolute devotion he had shown her in the freezing dark. "You taught me that a king's strength is not measured by who he leaves behind in the snow, but by who he carries through it." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, slow kiss. The cold wind whipped around them, but Camila felt nothing but the consuming, radiant heat of her alpha, her mate, her equal. A few feet away, the blind wolf let out a sharp, happy bark, his head tilted toward the rising sun. The winter was finally over. The reign of the blood moon had just begun. The laws of the blood moon were rewritten in fire and grace. The blind pup grew into a massive, fearsome beast, serving as the Alpha King's eternal shadow, proving that true strength lies not in perfection, but in spirit. Camila, the fragile Omega who dared to defy the frost, became the most beloved Luna in shifter history, a queen whose mercy was as legendary as her husband's wrath. Together, they ruled a pack where no pup was ever abandoned to the snow, and love proved to be the only force powerful enough to break the ancient curse of winter. If you felt the heat of this slow-burn romance and loved Camila's fierce defiance, please like, share, and subscribe to support more epic shifter stories.